sequence start. 6.
Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Dick, the NASA Chief Historian, and I want to welcome our NASA TV audience as well as everyone here at NASA headquarters. This is an exciting time as we look both backward and at history and we contemplate the future. We're here today to celebrate the Apollo 40th anniversary, and we've convened a distinguished panel to discuss Apollo's history and legacy. Today we have with us, to my left here, John Logsdon, the Lindbergh Chair in Aerospace History at the National Air and Space Museum; Roger Lonius, the Senior Curator in Space History at the Air and Space Museum; Michael Neufeld, the Chair of the Division of Space History at the Air and Space Museum and the author of the most recent biography of Wernher von Braun, Dreamer of Space, Engineer of War. Next to Michael, we have Christina Guidi, the Deputy Director of Constellation Systems in the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate here at NASA headquarters. And on the far end, we have Craig Nelson, who's the author of the very recently published book, Rocket Men, the Epic Story of the First Men on the Moon. Before we proceed, let me say that we're going to hold all questions for the press until the end of this hour. And before we go to the panel, it's my pleasure to introduce the acting NASA Administrator, Chris Scalise, who will say a few words on this historic occasion. Chris.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody. It really is a historic time here, the 40th anniversary of the launch of Apollo 11. Just yesterday, we launched Space Shuttle mission STS-127 from Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center, the same pad that launched Apollo 11 40 years ago. To give sort of a chronology of what that was, if we were living 40 years ago, many of us were, though looking in the audience, many of us weren't. I was glued to a black and white television watching this whole thing transpire. At 9:32 a.m. this morning, Apollo 11 would have lifted off. At 12:22 p.m., the translunar injection would have occurred after several orbits of the Earth. At 12:56, 40 years and a few minutes ago, the command and service modules would have docked with the lunar module and pulled it out and headed on the way to the moon for a 3-day journey. And on July 20th at 4:17 Eastern Daylight Time, the first humans landed on the moon, and later that evening, Neil Armstrong was the first human to set foot on another planet, the moon. I think many of us that remember those days, and I was, not yet in high school at the time, it was an absolutely incredible event, and how that inspired us. Only we can each speak individually about that. But those events were set forth by a goal set by President Kennedy in 1961 when he said, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. That was accomplished in 1969. It was one of the grand challenges that humanity seeks and what this nation seeks to accomplish. It shows the best of what we can accomplish, and it shows how we can accomplish it collectively as a nation and as a world. When you think about Apollo, think that it took 12,000 companies, 400,000 people, and $25 billion to complete the program. That was an incredible investment in the 1960s. Yet 500 years from now, when people look back on the 20th century, I think the challenge, the accomplishment, and the landing on the moon will be remembered as one of the great achievements of the 20th century. Perhaps maybe the greatest achievement of the 20th century. But many questions still surround the Apollo program. Was it really worth it? What were the lessons that we learned? What's been the impact over the last 40 years? What is its legacy in science, technology, the history of exploration, and the way we see the Earth? I don't think it's a surprise that that if you can remember, and you see the image in the back of the auditorium here, of the Earth that was taken by Apollo 8 in 1968 in December, that shortly thereafter Earth Day came along, and an awareness of the Earth and how fragile it is and how much we need to protect it came probably from Apollo. So these questions are still relevant today as we seek to go on and do bigger and bolder things with our new challenges and the new program that we're pursuing. We're driving onwards towards Mars, but we still need to ask some of the questions to look back to understand what happened. Today, as Steve mentioned, we have convened a distinguished panel to discuss Apollo's history, its legacy, and what it means for the future. Now I'll turn it over to Steve to take it over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, there's a great deal to discuss today, so I think we'll just get right to it. I think it's a safe bet that the United States never would have gone to the moon if it hadn't been for the competition with the Soviet Union. The geopolitical context was very important. So before we start, let's take a quick look at this clip.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
John Logsdon, we've been, I know you've been researching a new book on President Kennedy's role in the space race. Have you found anything new or revealing during your research?
Well, a number of things, Steve. One was how directly involved John F. Kennedy was in not only the decision to go to the moon, but in carrying out that decision. He paid careful attention to the program as it evolved after May 25th of 1961. He became increasingly concerned about the costs, and he kept emphasizing that. Even in the speech that was just shown to Congress in May of 1961, he improvised, saying this is a decision we all have to make because it's going to cost a lot of money. We have to make that commitment. And he was willing, at least for most of his presidency, to sustain that commitment. And at the end of 1962, he was trying to figure out ways of accelerating the first landing to be sure to be there before the Soviet Union. The NASA target was late 67 at that point. And he was told maybe it could be 6 months, even up to 12 months earlier. He seemed willing to pay that price. But 10 months later, he went before the UN and said, why should it be an area of national competition? Why don't we do it together with the Soviet Union? So it's where I am right now is trying to figure out what he was thinking in those last couple of months of his life. Was he ready? I don't think he was ready to abandon Apollo, but he may have been ready to slip the date a bit and see if we could do it together.
So why didn't we do it together?
Well, I think the political support was strongly tied to the competitive elements of Apollo. The Soviet Union at that point had not decided that it was going to race us to the moon. It did in the following year. So there wasn't a Soviet program to integrate with the U.S. And basically the Soviet Union and Nikita Khrushchev was only just coming to the notion that Kennedy could be trusted, that the United States could possibly be a partner. So, and one of these questions we'll never be able to answer is what would have happened if Kennedy had lived.
So let me turn to Roger. Roger, how serious was the space race? Were the Soviets ever close to getting humans on the moon? Was it a real race?
It was a real race, no question about that. But the Soviets were never really close to reaching the moon before us by any means. We didn't necessarily know that. And we made decisions based upon perceptions rather than the reality of the Soviet program. But there was a sense all the time that you come up to the point where we decide to race to the moon, where Kennedy does make his 61 speech, where it looks like the Soviets are kind of ahead of us. They are overtaking us. They are moving forward in a very aggressive program with Sputnik, with their first human flight, with Yuri Gagarin, with a succession of other firsts. And it's not until the mid-1960s, when really Gemini starts to be successful, that you get a change in public opinion, where people start thinking that, well, maybe the U.S. is as good as the Soviet Union and is actually surpassing them in their capabilities.
So with Kennedy's proclamation that we saw there in that first clip, the course was set for the moon. As Chris mentioned, there were 12,000 companies, 400,000 people, $20 or $25 billion for the Apollo program. Let's take a look at another clip before we go on. So Mike Neufeld, you wrote the biography of von Braun. We saw von Braun early in that clip. Could the United States have won the space race without von Braun?
Well, the moon race, it would have been hard to do it as soon as we did it. Whether we could have beaten the Soviets kind of depends also on them, and they clearly failed in many ways to fulfill their program. But he did play a very, very central role in having a booster that worked, and that was certainly his great contribution to the thing. The fact that Saturn V was so incredibly successful and never failed in spite of being the most challenging rocket engineering project ever attempted.
So von Braun certainly was one of the key players, but there were other key players. I'd like to go to Craig. I know in your book you talk about a lot of the key players. Who would be your candidate for one or two more of the key players in this program?
Well, I'd have to pick three. My number one would be Lyndon Johnson, who was at the birth of NASA by heading up the Senate and Eisenhower administration, who was behind the speech we saw Kennedy giving, and who made sure to reach those goals during his presidency, saying he owed it to Kennedy. My other two heroes of Apollo would be the Politburo, who deposed Khrushchev, and the medical team who let Sergei Korolev die on the operating table. I think that the Soviets losing their premier rocket scientist, or premier rocket engineer, excuse me, Mike, and their premier supporter of that rocket scientist was a profound blow to them, that Khrushchev could use Korolev's space achievements to imply that he had a military operation as powerful as the rockets orbiting in space, when he did not, and those two were formidable opponents.
So Chris, I know you weren't very old at the time that Apollo was launched, but from a point of view of operations, would you have a candidate for person who was crucial to the Apollo program?
I think I would have to say again von Braun. I mean, he designed an incredible launch vehicle, the Saturn V, and in the Constellation program, we're currently using a tremendous amount of legacy hardware or heritage from the Apollo program. So I think we're building on 40 years of spaceflight experience and employing it into the current program for Constellation.
And we're going to talk about that a little later also. Well, of course, we all know that the first manned Apollo flight was Apollo 7, but things really heated up with Apollo 8 with that circumnavigation of the moon that we all remember with the Christmas Eve reading of Genesis from around the moon. Let's take a look at that clip.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We are still go at this time. T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have cleared the tower. Roger. How do you hear, Houston? That's clear. The crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light. So Apollo 8 really was an incredible journey. Some people say it was one of the riskiest missions. The first time we actually left the Earth orbital area and went around the moon. Just how risky was that mission? Let's talk a little bit about how risky it was and what was involved in that mission. Roger, why don't you start us off?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Apollo 8 was truly remarkable. And quite frankly, adding to your comment earlier about who were some of the key people that made contributions, you've got a couple of them that come to the fore pretty importantly in the Apollo 8 story. And that is George Miller, who headed the human spaceflight program, Office of Manned Spaceflight in those days, and Sam Phillips, who ran the program office for Apollo. And the idea was, and it was a very gutsy decision, to fly humans the second time we had flown a crew in the Apollo spacecraft, and really the second time we had flown the Saturn V stack, to go to the moon with it. That was a remarkable and gutsy call on the part of some key people who had done assessments and decided that this was something they could pull off, and that they believed was probably necessary to ensure that they remained on schedule to make a landing by the end of the next year, by the end of the decade, and they did it. It was a wonderful success story, and it was a remarkable end to a pretty awful year in 1968, a year that started with enormous difficulties in Vietnam, with the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, with riots at the Democratic National Convention in the summer, and just on and on and on. And the whole nation seemed to be blowing up. And at the end of the year, this Apollo 8 flight, which was truly remarkable, where the astronauts talk about the good Earth and send Christmas greetings to all the people that reside there.
John, your thoughts?
I'd add to the hero list George Low.
Absolutely.
George was the one morning in July, with the lunar module being late on its schedule, went to see Bob Gilruth, head of the Manned Spacecraft Center, and said, "I've got an idea. Let's go around the moon." Chris Kraft was brought in. Could Operation support that? They called up von Braun in Huntsville and said, "Could we come over and talk to you?" Flew to Huntsville. Sam Phillips was at the Cape, and Kurt Debus, I believe it was, at the Cape, came to Huntsville. By that afternoon, the fundamental decision was made to do this mission. Like 6 hours. Can you imagine in today's world making a decision like that in 6 hours?
Mike, do you want to elaborate on that, how Von Braun felt?
I wanted to mention Bob Gilruth, and
Yeah.
John already mentioned him, but if we're going to lay out the key players in Apollo, here was a guy who built Houston from a little group at the Langley Center in 1958, creating the Mercury program, and going from that to this giant center. That was an enormous accomplishment, building the spacecraft and astronaut part of the Apollo program.
And how did Von Braun feel about this Apollo 8 going to the moon after the only one human spaceflight?
Well, I mean, as Roger outlined, that was a decision they made in his office, and basically he felt okay with the Saturn V because, in fact, it was the third launch, and the second one hadn't gone well at all. So it was also a risky decision to put a human on the Saturn V after the second test didn't go so well. But he had the total confidence in the system, in his engineers, and in the testing program that had revealed what had gone wrong on the second launch.
In agency history, what's fantastic about Apollo 8 is that the Apollo 1 fire had crippled the agency so terribly, and with so many executives and management people leaving, that really they were almost in a doldrums. And then Apollo 8 comes along, and this completely insane idea that works propels the agency forward. And really, we're ahead in the space race with the Soviets for the first time at that moment.
It's truly amazing when you think about it. The fire in 1967, and then this in 1968, the end of 1968, but we were already going around the moon.
I'd like to make a comment. Obviously, I'm of the younger generation. I was 4 during the Apollo program. But the one thing that does amaze me is the entire program itself, they were learning how to fly in space while also developing the launch vehicles and spacecraft. And I think that's a huge feat. Something that, once again, in the Constellation program, we're building on that experience over 40 years, and we don't have that extra challenge of learning how to fly in space. So I think that was amazing.
I think there's one still unresolved historical question related to Apollo 8. The CIA projected that the Soviet Union might send a crew around the moon, looping around the moon by the end of 1968. And question is, and I've looked at this paper record pretty carefully, but that would have been highly classified stuff. How much that influenced the decision to fly a mission to the moon? To make sure that we got not only on the moon, but to the moon before the Soviet Union.
Well, that had to be one of the drivers. If we hadn't been in this race and been worried, really, in a real sense, that they might beat us, surely we wouldn't have done this Apollo 8 mission at that time, right?
They were flying blind pretty much. The Pentagon and CIA did not share much with NASA, who they considered civilian blabbermouths. So they kept a lot of stuff to themselves. But a lot of stuff they kept to themselves wasn't worth sharing in the first place. So it didn't really miss out. But I believe NASA executives were pretty much flying blind against the Soviets.
I would agree with your point, Steve. I think they really were driven by this in a way that wouldn't be replicated now, because they took decisions that were risky at several points in time, and if they had been in another situation would said, well, do this when it's feasible, don't take any chances, then it would have taken 2 or 3 years longer to land on the moon probably.
So when did we find out that the Soviets were not really that much in the race?
After it was over.
Yeah, it wasn't until the end of the Cold War that we really had any true sense of what was taking place.
Right. It turns out they were blowing up rockets as we were going to the moon, right?
But we did know that they were building the moon rocket. Our now declassified Corona satellites took images of the N-1 rocket on the launch pad. We knew that they were developing the launch vehicle. I guess we didn't see Alexei Leonov was trained for the mission. They built a lunar lander. I guess we didn't see that until much later.
And they built a moon suit, which we didn't see until later.
On July 4th, '69, the CIA Corona satellite captured one of these giant rockets on the pad at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. And when it passed over a second time, it was gone, and it exploded on the pad.
Did they know when it exploded?
They knew something bad had happened, but it was not clear from this what had happened. And we found out, I think in 1974, that this rocket, if Apollo 11 had failed, this rocket was immediately going to attempt a moon landing.
I would argue with that, because I think, in fact, they were not ready to man the vehicle. In fact, they were several years away from manning that N-1 vehicle. This was just a launch test, and they hadn't had one that worked, and that one didn't work either, and in fact, it never did work. So I mean, I think the race was over in '68. but it was hard to tell that until the day that Apollo 11 pulled it off. And then you could look in hindsight and say, sure, we beat them on all fronts. You know?
Did they ever have a fancier name for the N1? Like, I mean, we had the Saturn V, which, you know, has a little class, but the N1 was never had a name, right?
No, it had not.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, in fact, that is, yeah, they only had acronyms.
That was the problem with losing Khrushchev. He came up with all these spiffy names for the rockets, too.
Okay, let's move on then. With Apollo 10, we came within a few thousand feet of the lunar surface, and then came Apollo 11. Let's watch.
Feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Big shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Mode control, both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in.
We've had shutdown.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Okay, everybody, T1. Stand by for T1.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Okay, T1. Stay, no stay. Retro. Stay. Fido. Stay. Guide. Stay. Patrol. Stay. Telcom. Stay. GNC. Stay. Ecom. Stay. Surgeon. Stay. Capcom, we're stay for T1.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Here, men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon. July 1969, AD. It came in peace for all mankind.
Those are all iconic images that many of us remember, maybe not Chris, but a lot of us remember where we were at that time. And just today, NASA released some of the new higher resolution footage from those images. There are lots of questions we can address here. Let's start with the question of how did it happen that Armstrong and Aldrin were the first 2 humans on the moon?
Well, it's because all the missions before 11 went off perfectly. I mean, the crews were chosen for a sequence of missions. The first G mission, which was the landing mission, crew was chosen in January, but that meant that Apollo 9 and Apollo 10 had to be successful for them to be the ones to try the landing on 11. So in a sense, it was normal program management.
Yeah, there wasn't anything magical about this, and of course, crew rotation is one of the great parlor games that those of us who are kind of space cadets like to play. You know, who would have been on what mission if something had happened, and so on and so forth. And we can never know the answer to those things. But the reality was that through the machinations of the astronaut office, this particular crew got put together, and it was assigned to this particular mission. The previous flights, as John said, did perform their tasks successfully. Had they not done so and had to repeat the same mission to figure out how to do this thing, it would have fallen to Pete Conrad or someone else down the road to make that first landing.
We saw that landing on the footage there. Why was that landing so unexpectedly exciting with only a few seconds of fuel left? Was that planned or not planned, or what's the story there?
It was the most difficult landing in general to pull off because, of course, partly because after they did it once, they knew how to do it better. But they had a problem with the computer alarms because of a conflict between the rendezvous radar and the landing radar. They had a problem of targeting, so they couldn't target the thing very accurately, and they ended up coming down towards a field of boulders, and Armstrong had to go manual and go over top of it and stretch his landing out.
One of my favorite discoveries in doing this book was to read about how everyone at Mission Control is turning blue, waiting for them to land, fearful they're going to run out of gas and crash. And one guy had done tests up at Grumman with the lunar module, and he had found that if they tried to come down with too much propellant in the tank, the blowback might blow up the ship. So while everyone at Mission Control is praying they don't run out of gas, he's praying that they do.
Well, I think Chris can tell you, we've got Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in orbit around the moon now to look for landing sites. I mean, we landed on the moon in 1969 with very limited information about the lunar surface. And so the navigation had them going to this field of boulders. And it was only because you had a really good pilot named Neil Armstrong to take over manual control and fly that thing for, 90 seconds or so away from danger that the landing was successful.
Well, we did have the lunar orbiters, but I guess the resolution wasn't that good, right?
Not as good as we're getting now.
Right.
Well, he had all of these charts and pictures, but they were from 4 miles behind him.
Right.
So.
Okay, well, we get a lot of questions from the public and they're about this mission in particular. One of the questions that we got this last week is, were Armstrong's words scripted or were they his own?
All his own. He wasn't even going to say a thing. And in fact, he didn't say a thing for the whole 90 seconds he's landing, and everyone is going crazy back home. He said later that he was inspired by the game Giant Steps, Baby Steps, also known as Mother May I. And I grew up in a family of Midwestern drawlers, so I can actually hear him say "a man" when I hear this tape. And I'm apparently the only person who's ever heard him say "a man" when he heard this. I think it's remarkable that someone as shy and as physics and math oriented as Armstrong came up with one of the greatest lines in history. It's a beautiful, beautiful expression. Really fantastic.
So what about that one small step for a man? That's another question we always get. Did he say amen or not? Because there have been voice analyses done and they seem ambiguous.
Well, I mean, nobody really hears it on the tape, except, of course, Craig. So it doesn't make quite the same sense as it would if he'd said that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. It's quite conceivable that in the excitement of the moment, he simply passed over what he had thought about saying. Mm-hmm. Heck, that happens to everybody all the time. If he did indeed say it, and there has been some voice analysis done by some engineers who've gone back and looked at the digital recording of this to suggest that there is an A in there somewhere that kind of got lost in the transmission. If that's the case, then terrific. Does it really matter? No.
Well, the bottom line is that Armstrong himself says that he meant to say it, right?
Yes, he did intend to say it.
Right.
And he's asked us to write it with a parenthesis, and I think we owe him that. The
Okay,
little
so
A in the parenthesis.
that solves that problem. Right?
Yeah.
Another question we always get is, did Armstrong and Aldrin have cyanide pills in case the ascent engine didn't work?
All they needed to do was take off their helmets. I came across one report of someone who, in a NASA experiment, had experienced vacuum, and he said that after 12 seconds he could feel the saliva on the tongue beginning to boil, and then he passed out and they pulled him out. But I'm not sure how accurate that is. But all they had to do was pull off their helmets, and they'd be gone.
That's a huge urban legend. A lot of people think that's true. And finally, what do you say to skeptics who say, "How do you prove that we ever went to the moon?"
Mm-hmm. 800 pounds of moon rocks, for starters, distributed all over the world.
My favorite is another Armstrong quote. He says he thinks it was so much easier to just go there than it would be to fake it.
With 12,000 companies, 400,000 people.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. But my favorite is, in fact, the reports of the astronauts coming back from the moon when you piece them all together and get this whole picture of what it's like to be there. It's so bizarre. No one could have made this up before going.
Well, and I was there on July the 16th, 1969. I got up in the middle of the morning at the operations building and watched the crew walk by me on their way to the pad and then saw the launch. So they had to go somewhere. And you know, there's a law in philosophy called Occam's razor that says pick the simplest explanation. And the simplest explanation is that they went.
But there are something like 5 or 6% of the American population that are skeptics still. Maybe that says something
Thereabouts.
about our society.
Well, it says a lot about our society. I think we love conspiracies. I mean,
Right.
maybe the whole world does, but we love to think that there's these outrageous things that are somehow being manipulated behind the scenes to pull one over on us.
Branch of psychology.
And of course, it is nuts at some level. But I will say that the diehard believers in a conspiracy theory will not be persuaded by evidence, no matter what evidence there is. So you cannot prove it to them.
We're, by the way, about to get evidence. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has a 1.4 meter resolution. So it's going to show us the descent stages of the lunar modules sitting at the landing sites.
I have a feeling some people still won't be satisfied.
Well, they will simply say you faked those images and you're a part of the conspiracy.
Okay, let's turn to the science and the engineering aspects of Apollo. Was it worth it for the science?
Absolutely. I would agree that, I mean, it was not a scientific program in its origins. It was not done for science. It was done to beat the Soviets. But after we had mastered the ability to land on the moon, we kept going back at least long enough until the money ran out that a massive amount of lunar science was done in the process of, especially of the last 4 landings.
Yeah, I mean, the key, there's actually, lunar scientists have come up with a top 10 list of things that we learned from going to the moon, and they're pretty spectacular. But number 1 on that list is a fairly definitive statement of the origins of the moon. And it's strikingly different from any of the theories that had been promulgated before we went to the moon. Where now most scientists are of the belief that in the primordial solar system there was a body out there, probably the size of Mars or so, that impacted the Earth, and pieces of both the Earth and the moon and other things around all coalesced to form this. And as a result of that, we learned a lot about the science of the moon and its evolution since its creation.
But isn't it a fair statement to say that scientists at the time thought they were taking a backseat to the engineering or political aspects?
And oh, by the way, they were. I mean, science rode piggyback on the engineering program to go to the moon. They did so very effectively, but that was not the purpose of going. That was, at best, something that they thought about down the road. And those last few missions, as Mike said, were really enormously significant as treasure troves of scientific knowledge.
Well, and there were several more missions planned, which would have been even more productive scientifically. I mean, one of the points to make now in 2009 is there's lots of science left to do. We didn't finish with the moon.
Yeah, people also forget that there were 5,000 pounds, I think, of scientific equipment left on the moon during the Apollo program.
Including some really good cameras.
Right.
But I think, just the very fact that before Apollo, interplanetary travel was science fiction, and now it's a reality. Mm-hmm. Now we know how to use enormous explosions as a method of transportation. I think it's fantastic. It's worth it just for that.
Right. Okay, we could go on and on about Apollo 11, but let's move forward here. Apollo, of course, had 6 more lunar missions after Apollo 11. The Apollo 12 landed near Surveyor spacecraft, and that mission was a great success, but then there came Apollo 13. Let's take a look.
2. He's got it made. Come on in there. 24 feet. Contact light.
Roger, copy contact.
That's what I see sitting on the side of the crater. The old surveyor, huh? The old surveyor, yes, sir.
Dane, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks.
Okay.
Stand by.
Hey,
Houston, we've had a problem here.
Houston, we've had a problem.
That footage and the fact that Apollo 12 landed within a few hundred feet of the Surveyor there and actually brought back pieces of Surveyor. But let's talk a little bit about Apollo 13. What's the most important lesson we learned from Apollo 13? How close did we come to disaster with 13?
Inches away, but you know, the lesson of 13, you see almost every mission that flew in Apollo. They are constantly having death-defying moments on these missions, such as using the pen cap to arm the return rocket on 11, that the astronauts are so well trained by NASA that they figure out a way around and figure out how to fix it. And 13 is the most severe form of that.
Well, I think one of the things we forget is just how risky this was. I think it was Roger or Mike earlier said, we've become risk averse. Maybe because we've had the shuttle accidents, but every Apollo mission was right at the edge of performance. And there were people, including Bob Gilruth, who were would have been perfectly happy to quit after 11, saying we met our goal, beat the Russians to the moon. This is too risky to keep doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. Have we become today too risk averse with the shuttle program or with the more modern programs?
You know, risk is a relative thing. What are we willing to accept? You can't get out of bed without accepting a measure of risk. And we all calculate that all the time in our own lives. In fact, I don't think you can stay in bed without a measure of risk. Maybe the ceiling falls on you or something. But what is an acceptable level? Obviously, flying in space takes an acceptance of a certain measure of risk, and it is out on the margin somewhat. Can you calculate that and effectively try to bring down that riskiness? Yes, you can, and we do that all the time. One of the things that I think happens when we start talking about shuttle accidents, for instance, and let's not forget that we lost the crew of Apollo 1 in 1967 in an accident as well, that it happens so rarely and the events themselves are so publicly seen. I mean, every launch is on television and so on and so forth, that when you have this sort of accident, there's a very public sense about it, and there's an expectation that we will not fail. And NASA has demonstrated over and over again its ability to overcome those odds and not to fail and to be successful. And we take it as a given that they will be successful. So when the risk factors come out of line, when we do lose a crew, it's all the more disturbing, I think.
Chris, you're involved in the current operations or the future exploration program. These are very real life and death questions to you. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with Roger. I think NASA has a very strong risk management system. So we are concerned about risk, and we need to understand the risk that we are taking. But I agree. We're trying to educate the public, especially during a development program, that there will be failures, and we learn from those failures. So we do everything that we can possible to make sure that we don't have those failures, but they are going to be failures. I mean, there will be. Now, when it comes to crew, obviously we have to take that extra step to make sure that the crew is protected. But during a development program, there will be failures, and that's a good thing because we do learn from it.
Well, almost the flip side of this, the risks have to be worth taking, because the risks are never going to be zero. I mean, what made Apollo great was we took pretty significant risks to do something grand. And I think the program that Chris is involved in, once again preparing to send people beyond Earth orbit, is something worth taking risks to do. So there is a benefit risk calculation, and the benefits have to be great to accept the risks that are involved in spaceflight.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be a difference between the public perception and the astronauts' perception. I think the astronauts all know that there's this risk. The public often doesn't seem willing to accept that risk. And I think, a few years ago we had a symposium on risk and exploration where the question was, how much risk do you take in the name of forward-looking exploration? And one of the outcomes of that was that you just have to let the public know and realize that risk is part of exploration, and there are going to be these kinds of things that happen.
One of the Apollo wives said a remarkable thing. She said that, they take a lot more care with these spacecraft than they do with the military test craft that these guys were flying before they became astronauts. And she also mentioned that if the people during the 60s, if the astronauts during the 60s hadn't been astronauts, they would have been flying in Vietnam. So it's a wholly different origin of risk that they come to from where we start as
Yeah,
civilians.
the test pilots brings to mind Tom Wolfe and The Right Stuff. You read those stories in there.
Right, but also when you really look into that, you come into this thinking astronauts are these wild daredevil cowboy types, when in fact they're cool characters. And the daredevil cowboy types were the NASA administrators pushing the envelope in the space race.
Okay, so let's talk about the ending of Apollo. There were 4 more landing missions. There was Apollo 14, then there were Apollos 15 to 17, which had the lunar rovers. Let's take a look at this.
We're on the surface. Okay, we made a good landing. We're going to try a little sand trap shot here. Miles and miles and miles. Good. This is really a rock and roll ride, isn't it? Never been on a ride like this before. Oh boy. I'm glad they got this great suspension system on this thing. Hey, John, this is perfect with the LIM and the rover and you and Stone Mountain and the old flag. Come on out here and give me a salute. Big Navy salute. Okay, Houston, the Challenger has landed. Roger, Challenger, that's super. Houston, you can tell America that Challenger is a Taurus Littrow. This valley of history has seen mankind complete its first evolutionary steps into the universe. 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston.
Just amazing images. Those rovers really look like fun, and they look like they were exceeding the speed limit there. Well, we all know that even as the first moon landings were taking place, that the budgets were being cut. We know that the last 3 Saturn V's that were destined for the moon are now in museums in Florida and in Alabama and in Houston, where they are very nicely displayed. But the Apollo program did come to a rather abrupt end. Let's talk about what the reasons were for that. And why? Well, let's talk about that first. What were the reasons for the abrupt ending of the Apollo program?
Lack of public support, fundamentally. I mean, there's just no way to get around the fact that most Americans felt after Apollo 11, well, we've done that. How many more times do we need to do it? The public support had already eroded ever since the mid-60s. And the missions from Apollo 8 to 11 essentially provided a temporary boost in enthusiasm for the space program. And soon after Apollo 11, everybody was back to worrying about Vietnam, poverty, riots, many other things that just seemed of a higher priority than continuing to spend on Apollo.
Well, there were a variety of reasons. I mean, the Nixon administration wanted to cut the federal budget overall, and NASA was a prime target for doing that. There were serious proposals to cut the last 2, cut 16 and 17 in the summer of '71. Cap Weinberger, who at that point was deputy head of OMB, I wrote a memo to Nixon saying this would confirm that we're giving up our world leadership position, that we can do something better than welfare programs. But there was a great financial pressure, and NASA as an institution wanted to get on to do something new. NASA, after all, is an engineering development organization. Flying repetitive missions is not what NASA thought it was supposed to be doing. So they were ready to, Houston and Huntsville in particular, were ready to move on to the next program, which they thought at that point would be using Saturn V's to launch space stations. So there wasn't a lot of support even inside the agency for repetitive missions to the moon.
But in retrospect, was it a mistake for the United States to throw away this infrastructure, this Saturn V and command module, this entire infrastructure? I think, John, you said that NASA at 50 is still suffering from decisions made at NASA at 12. What about that?
Well, I think it was a tragedy to throw away the Saturn V. I mean, the key to future exploration is a heavy lift vehicle. We had one. We had a really good one. And we let it go away. I mean, command modules and lunar modules, less thing. It's really giving up Saturn V. Think of what the space station would look like if we could launch it on a 33-foot diameter launch vehicle with heavy lift capability. We would have had a space station much more quickly and a more capable space station. So that was, I think, a failure of national leadership to give up that capability.
I think you also have to ask the question, I mean, we weren't going to fly Saturn V's for very much longer anyway. And
why not?
It's technology that was becoming outmoded even at the time that it was being flown. And I've had people, I know you've heard these stories about, oh, NASA's lost the blueprint. They usually cast it as they've lost the blueprints for the Saturn V and they couldn't go find those and build more Saturn V's. Well, the answer to that is, well, actually they do exist and they're in a big warehouse in the National Archives. But more important than that, why would you want to build a Saturn V? It's a piece of technology that was outmoded even at the point it was being used. And it should have been, and we should move on from there. Shuttle was really designed as a piece of a critical infrastructure to move forward. And with shuttle and a station and then potential to go on from the station as a jumping off point. That made a lot of sense, even for the people at the time to pursue.
So how about now? NASA is ramping down the shuttle and ramping up the new system. Is it a mistake to get rid of that technology?
You know, I mean, people of goodwill can come down on both sides of that argument. Mm-hmm. And there are cases to be made on all sides of that. You know, the charitable thing would be to say that the shuttle was a remarkable experimental vehicle, and it was. And it has served the needs of... That's true. It still is. It's not retired yet. Next
still
year.
Experimental.
It's still experimental. And when it retires, we should give it an honorable retirement because it deserves that after serving very, very well for a long period of time, and to move on to the next generation vehicle. Should that vehicle look like a shuttle or should it be something else? The architecture for Constellation sends us in a different direction, and there are pros and cons and trade-offs on both.
That's a good segue into our next segment here. Apollo has many legacies, but one of them is its technological legacy. Part of that technology will be used to go back to the moon as part of the Constellation program. Let's look at a final clip. Chris, you're the Deputy Director of Constellation Systems. Some of that hardware looked pretty familiar.
Yes, it does. As you can see, we're actually using heritage from Shuttle as well as Apollo. You saw some of the clips there. We're using the solid rocket motors for the Ares 1 first stage, as well as the first stage for the Ares 5 launch vehicle. So there's a lot of commonality between the two launch vehicles that we're using for Constellation. In addition, it wasn't shown there, but Apollo heritage, something very, very obvious from a physical perspective, is we're using the same capsule shape as Apollo. The only thing is on the Constellation side, it's actually just over 16 feet in diameter, and it's going to carry 4 crew to lunar orbit, where Apollo was, I believe, just under 13 and carried 3. So we're actually increasing the capability of Apollo, but using the same kind of concepts. You mentioned the Saturn V, 33 feet in diameter. Our current Ares 5 launch vehicle concept is using a 33-foot diameter core stage as well. So we are going to be able to use some of the same facilities, potential processing techniques and tools. So again, we're taking the lessons learned from the Apollo era and employing them in the Constellation program. The J2X is the upper stage engine for Ares 1, as well as the Earth departure stage for Ares 5. Once again, commonality between the two launch vehicles. What we're trying to do is lower our life cycle cost development across the two launch vehicles by using a lot of common elements. That brings is heritage hardware. It's based on heritage hardware from the Apollo. The J2 engine, which was Saturn V and S1B. Keep me straight, historians here. We're using the same components and philosophy of the J2 and the J2S, which was a simplified version of J2.
I wish we had more time to go into those details, but I do want to ask a final question, which is about the legacy of Apollo. We see there that some of the technological legacy. How about the legacy of Apollo in general? How important was Apollo? And I'd like each of you to address that question. Let me start with Craig.
Well, I think Apollo was really a reaction to a profound fear, and this is part of the Cold War we forget. When the Soviets established their early dominance in the space race, many Americans, up to Lyndon Johnson in the halls of the Senate, believed that they were going to turn it into a battlefield. And part of what going to the moon did was prove that we could defend ourselves in space if that indeed turned into a Cold War battlefield. And I think another thing that's not discussed enough in this history is what a profound economic stimulus this was for the South. It created 400,000 jobs. It brought technology across the whole of the Gulf Coast and created sort of a whole new life for many people, not just engineers and scientists, but seamstresses and plumbers. So I look at that too.
Okay, Chris has already talked about technological legacy. Yep. Michael.
Well, certainly the scientific legacy, as we mentioned before, of the lunar landings was very, very important, and clearly it remains an inspirational legacy for that. These anniversaries always show that people around the world, and not just in the United States, are really inspired by that accomplishment.
Roger.
I think one of the things that's significant that nobody necessarily anticipated at the time, but has come down to us as pretty significant since then, is our new perspective that we saw on Earth as we looked back, and the sense of appreciation and wonder of this little spaceship that we're riding on, and how it houses all of the life and all of the things we've ever loved and hated. Are right here, and that it is a fragile thing that must be protected.
John.
Well, and the complement to Roger's observation is that Apollo also showed us that we don't have to stay on this planet forever. It was the first step in a centuries-long process of moving humanity into the solar system. Hopefully we're going to continue to do that in the next few years. But Apollo, when we look back, will be the first step in an evolution of humanity to a multi-planet species.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thanks very much to the panel. And on this day, when we have 13 astronauts in Earth orbit, thank you all for joining us here at NASA headquarters on this historic occasion.